Now, changing the perspective within the image is one thing, and generally that's happening because you're starting with an image devoid of perspective, like these textures were taken straight on, and that makes them very useful. Well, there's gonna be a lot of situations like working on this box here or these boxes in the corner where the photo you find is not taken from the right vantage point. If you can find one that's taken perfectly from this angle, well, that's great. Most likely, it's not gonna be. So if we want to do some photo texture here on these boxes, we might start with a photo like this one. What I like about this photo is that this edge here is in a shadow. We can see this right here is in the sun. Sun is bad for textures because it pulls out too much contrast. This shadow area is really uniform. It can kind of adopt whatever lighting we want in any scene. It's essentially low contrast and very uniform, which is good. What's bad about it is the perspective does not match our scene at all. A very good skill to have is to be able to remove perspective from an image. So the way I like to do this is I'll turn on the grid. And your grid might look a little different than this. I've gone into the settings and just changed the scale of it so it's a little bit smaller. But really it just gives me a visual guide. So what I'm gonna do is just copy one of these sides here. So I've got it on its own. If you want to, you can just give yourself a solid color that'll kind of make it a little more visible. And my goal is just to make it match the grid. And I'm just gonna use the free transform tools, specifically holding down Control and skewing these corner pins. And there's no perfect way to do this. It just takes a little practice. Sometimes it takes more than one step. So I'll say, that's good for step one. And then I'll do it one more time here. And I'm looking at the wrinkles in the image. That's kind of what I'm lining up with these grid lines. It's looking pretty good. Okay. This then is much more useful. And I actually also want to do the same with the box top, because this bit here I think is going to work well for my box top in the foreground. So I'll make a copy, paste it here. And in this case, I have to think about what's my intention, because if your ultimate goal has a lot of foreshortening in it, like this box top right here, it's actually a bit counterproductive to take all the perspective out of it. Because if I were to flatten it out like I did with that last box, then I'd bring it in here and I'd have to just foreshorten it again. I'd be squeezing it back down. That's a very lossy process. What I want to do is to end up with something that closer matches the actual perspective in my illustration. And in this case, that means flat and foreshortened. So I come back to my image, and in this case, I want to pull just the left-right perspective out of it. A bit like that. But I want to keep it foreshortened, keep it flat like that. So that's pretty good. And that'll be much more useful to me. What I'm left with now are two pieces, and these resemble game textures much more than the original photo. Because when we look at the original photo, it looks like a box, but it doesn't actually have any relevance to my image. Really, it's only the details that I like, not the composition. So now I've taken the details and made them match my composition. Now another trouble area here is lighting. I like to make a black and white layer. Again, I do that by doing a hue saturation adjustment layer set to the color blending mode, which I almost always call BW. Okay, so with that toggled on, we can see that the left side of the cardboard is a lot lighter than the right side. In my case, I'm gonna wanna use it as an overlay blending mode. And so I've got kind of two steps here. The first step is I need to make the sides match each other. And then I need to make the overall thing hover around 50%, just like we did before. So I'm gonna do this with an adjustment layer. If I clip an adjustment layer after making a selection, here's how this works. So I make a selection, left half. I make an adjustment layer, levels. So you can see here, I'm just changing what was inside that selection. But I only want it to affect the cardboard, so I use it as a clipping mask. And in those two steps, it's both only affecting the cardboard layer, and it's only affecting it within the mask. I'm gonna leave those two as kind of a hard separation now, but I'm gonna fade it out in a second. So my goal is to make this left side match the right side in tonality. This is a great opportunity to have my two tools here. So I have properties up top, histogram down below. This is my goal. I want it to be over here on the right. See this narrow band? What I actually have right here is shifted to the left. So with my adjustment layer, I am just going to pull down those values a little bit to shift it to the left. And so before and after, I think it's the right amount of darkness. The problem is this dividing line is throwing us off because that is this mask we're seeing. Well, I want to actually soften the edge of that mask so I can have whatever effect I'm doing have a bit of a fall off. So I'm just painting with black and I'm painting in the layer mask just to kind of smooth that out. So just so you can see what's going on, this is the area the effect is happening to, and then it gradually fades out. If I were to do an extreme change here, like making it bright, you could see that much more clearly. But this is a great way to gradually affect one part of the image and then blend it back in with the rest. Now, if you wanted to be really, really picky, you could actually get out your info panel here and you could put down 2 markers. So I'm getting my color sampler tool. I'm going to put down 1 on the right, 2 on the left, and then set both of those to be HSB color. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the brightness value of both. So brightness number 1 is my target, and that's 38%. Brightness number 2, the one I'm working with, is currently reading at 45%. So it could be theoretically 7% darker. Let's see if we can do that. So in my adjustment layer, I'm just going to pull it down a little bit. Okay, so it's telling me now that the left side, marker number 2 is 38, marker number 1 is 38, but I bet this middle bit here is actually a little lighter. So I look in the middle, number 3, set that to HSB, and sure enough, that's 42. So I could continue to finesse this if I want. I'm going to make a new adjustment layer here just for this middle chunk. I'll say levels, pull it down a bit. Oh, can't forget to make it a clipping mask. And I'm also going to, once again, soften the edges of the selection. And then here, working with this second levels adjustment layer, I'm just affecting the middle, but I can pull that down until it also reads 38%. So with those 2 different adjustment layers, you can see I've turned them both off. Here's turning one on and the other one on. I have selectively modified the values such that it is perfectly uniform. I got really anal and I checked those with the info tool. I don't think that part's necessary. You just kind of train your eye to see the same thing, but it works well for a demonstration. But then overall, I still want to check my general value distribution. And I see here that it's still too dark. I wanted this to all hover around 50%. So I can make yet again one more levels adjustment layer. And watching my info panel again, I should be able to bring all these up simultaneously to about 50%. Because first I made them all match one another, and then with this overall adjustment layer, I can change the whole group uniformly. So there we go. I've gotten them centered at 50%. Now the question is it high enough contrast? And I might want to actually change the black and white points to add contrast, but then change the midpoint to rest back at 50%. Now I'm going to turn off black and white mode. It might be that my image, the rough, actually had the color information, so I would then want to make yet another adjustment mode and pull out some of the color. It's nice to leave a little in there sometimes. Now clearly this was a lot of steps, and you don't necessarily need to be nearly so precious with it. But what I've done here is I've taken the perspective out of the photo, and then using adjustment layers, I have made it essentially the perfectly controlled overlay layer. Because I knew what I wanted was a low contrast, 50% value, and I wanted to take out any ununiform areas from the photo. So I've essentially reverse engineered a photo to become much more like a game texture. And the result is something that's going to be really, really useful for me. Now with these info dots on here, I don't need them anymore, so you can just hold Alt and cut them. And now we're ready to go. So I am gonna then make this selection, flat copy, come back into my image. I've already made a selection and a mask, so I can just drop these right into place. Make sure the scale is good. And then I'm gonna skew it to kind of match the actual layout of my box. Maybe that's good. And then I set it to the overlay blending mode. And there we go. Here I have added a little bit of saturation, and maybe I'm thinking it's slightly too saturated, so I can pull a bit of that out. But I've added photographic details without changing the overall value arrangement of my image. I was not controlled by the photo, I controlled the photo. I knew what I wanted and I modified the texture until it was right. So let's bring that over here for another copy to be the sides of these boxes. And this is probably going to be too dark to see on the video. Know that it's visible on my screen. But the box tops, I want those to be lightening value. I want that really to read as kind of higher contrast, glancing angle reflection. So I come back to my image. I come to my box top that I've now made. And I do want it to be an overlay layer still. I just want it to be a little higher contrast and a little brighter value. So go back into black and white mode, make an adjustment layer. To make this a little easier on myself, if I don't want to actually be measuring anything, a trick I like to do is just to make a gray layer underneath. Right now I have this random green as a background, but if I just make a 50% gray and put it back here, now visually I can compare. So I go back into black and white mode. This is obviously brighter. How much brighter? I'm not exactly sure, but it's brighter. If I were to use the levels adjustment, I can bring it down until just about there. That's pretty much 50%. Is it exact? No, but it's enough. So I know I want it to be a little bit lighter and a little higher contrast, but still kind of in the 50% range. And that's usually about as exact as I get. So I go to make a flat copy of that, come back into my image, paste it. And in this case, I think I want to set it to be overlay. We'll see how overlay looks. That was my goal. Yeah, and that's actually going to be enough contrast. So we can see here the perspective's not quite right. Might want to shift it a little bit. But that gives me those box details that I was looking for. And the final here, another texture I'm using is this concrete block wall. But it's got these interesting fasteners. It's sort of a poured concrete technique. Sometimes you are able to find a photo that's mostly useful, but still not perfect. In this case, obviously I don't want the chair. I don't want this floor surface. And you can see once again, there's that light-dark transition. The lighting is not uniform. Well, there's some tools that makes this really, really easy. In more modern versions of Photoshop, the Spot Healing Brush tool pretty much just makes magic happen. Here I am just drawing over top of the chair. I let it think a minute, and it just fixes it. Same with all this little stuff. Just kind of draw over it, make it go away. Isn't that amazing? This stuff just blows my mind. And then, of course, you are going to end up with a few errors, like there's no divider between those, so you could copy one from another spot, bring it over. Maybe its values are wrong now, so you have to kind of lighten it up to make it just right. And then you might use a mask to softly paint out the edge here. So you're kind of hiding that little seam you made. That's not bad. Now I might do a flat copy of the entire image and paste just so I can stretch it a little bit and get rid of that bottom. I also could have cropped it out. Either way it'd work fine. And then finally I have this fade. So once again, I'll make a selection that's pretty much the right area, do a levels adjustment, tweak it until it looks correct. And of course I want to soften that transition here for my effect. So I'm really only affecting kind of the upper left corner primarily. But I just do a quick gut check. It's looking pretty good. And then maybe an overall one, just to make sure that my values are sitting around 50%. And maybe I want to lower the overall contrast a little bit. So once again, checking here, yeah, okay. I would say this is a much more useful photo than the original. The original is pretty good, didn't have to take out much perspective, and it didn't really take long, especially with that healing brush, to get to a much more useful image. Now, a cardboard box might seem like an extremely mundane part of my image and absolutely not worth spending all that time on. But the really important takeaway is that this process is how you master photos. If this is the best you can find online, it's still very useful, but it's not so useful in this state. I'd argue that turning it into these elements gives you so much more flexibility. And honestly, once you've done all this work to turn it into this sort of a orthographic image, save it in your texture library. You can use this for every cardboard box you use in the future, and then you don't need to hunt it down and cut it apart. Now you've just got a texture photo. And while I almost never use the color sample tool and actually care about, the exact brightness percentage, know that these are great training wheels to learn to do this by eye. You're not gonna be able to do it by eye to start with, so sometimes a little measurement is a good way to build confidence.